Hi, I'm Mandy Medley. I'm one of the co-owners and workers at Pilsen Community Books, and as someone who has been following and inspired by Sarah Jaffe's work for such a long time, I am so excited to welcome Micah Uetricht, Kenzo Shibata, and Sarah here tonight to celebrate Sarah's new book, Work Won't Love You Back, out just yesterday from Bold Type Books. And thank you especially to Kenzo for joining us here tonight during a week that is very eventful for Chicago teachers. We're very grateful that you're here. A couple of notes about how this evening will go. First, I'll introduce everyone, then I'll turn it over to Micah, and we will have time for a few questions at the end. So if you have any questions at all during the event, just drop them in the chat on YouTube, and I'll make sure they get to the right place at the right time. And I would be a terrible bookseller and coworker if I did not mention that you can support Chicago's only worker-owned and operated independent bookstore by buying Sarah's book on our website, pilsencommunitybooks.com, for curbside pickup or delivery. Thanks for your support. And I'll introduce tonight's guests. Micah Uetricht is the deputy editor of Jaffe magazine. He is the author of two books that we love to carry in the store, Strike for America, Chicago Teachers Against Austerity, and a co-author of Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism, and co-editor of a collection of oral histories with New Left radicals who took jobs in industries like steel and auto with the intention of organizing after the 1960s, which will be out in 2022 from Verso. He hosts a Jacobin radio podcast, Vast Majority, and is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. Kenzo Shibata is an educator and socialist labor organizer in Chicago. He's a founding member of the Caucus of Rank-and-File Educators, a high school vice president of the Chicago Teachers Union, and president of the Illinois chapter of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And he's host of the Class Time podcast and stream. And Sarah Jaffe is a Type Media Center fellow and an independent journalist covering the politics of power from the workplace to the streets. She's the author of Necessary Trouble, another one of our favorites at the store. And her work has appeared in New York Times, The Nation, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The New Republic, The American Prospect, and many other publications. She is co-host with Michelle Chen of Dissent Magazine's Belabored podcast, as well as a columnist at the Progressive and New Labor Forum. And with that, I will turn it over to Micah. Thanks, Micah.
Thank you, Mandy. And before we get into Sarah's book, I just want to say for people who are watching, probably a lot of people from Chicago who are hopefully familiar with Pilsen Community Books and other people from elsewhere who maybe are not. But Pilsen Community Books is an amazing bookstore. One, as Mandy mentioned, the only worker-owned bookstore co-op in the city. Also a damn good bookstore, if I have to say so myself. One that has one of the best selections in the city. So folks should, I think you're closed right now, right, Mandy, which is probably the right thing to do. But when you all reopen, folks should definitely, who are in Chicago, should be paying a visit, or folks who are visiting Chicago should pay a visit to Pilsen Community Books. It's really a wonderful community resource, and of course, a great resource for putting on events like this, which are so wonderful and necessary. We did this several years ago when Sarah's first book came out, and we did it in the the way that these events are supposed to be done, in person and with hugs and drinks and camaraderie. And now, of course, we're not able to do that. But I'm very grateful for Pilsen Community Books for organizing this, if for no other reason that I haven't done this in a while. So I appreciate that. So we are here, of course, to talk about Sarah's wonderful new book, Work Won't Love You Back. And there's a lot in the book that is of direct relevance to a lot that's going on in this city right now, which we're going to get into with Kenzo, especially in a second. But why don't we just start, Sarah, with you reading a little bit from the book.
Yeah, so I thought I'd just read a little bit from the introduction here, because that will sort of set up the conversation that we're going to have, which I imagine we will spend a lot of time talking about a few kinds of workers in particular. But to give us a little background here, so this is sort of midway through my introduction. The idea that work should be a source of fulfillment has become common sense in our world, to the extent that saying otherwise is an act of rebellion. The Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci reminded us that common sense itself is a product of history, that popular beliefs are in fact material forces, and they change when material conditions change. His concept of hegemony explains to us how one group comes to arrange the world in its own interests, through culture and ideas as well as material forces. Hegemony is the process by which we are made to consent to the power structures that shape our lives. The thing about common sense is that it's often wrong, and we may even be aware on some level that it's wrong. You are, after all, well, listening to me read from this book, because something told you that maybe, just maybe, the problem is not you, it's work. But we don't have to truly believe in order to consent. Many of us simply act as if we believe, and that is enough. Max Weber famously wrote of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, the way that the rise of Protestantism lent a belief in hard work as a calling and deferred gratification in heaven to the developing capitalism of the time. The first spirit of capitalism valued above all the accumulation of more and more money for its own sake, like those hedge funders that are all mad about GameStop. Not for the sake of consumption. My goodness, no. Consumption and other forms of pleasure were in fact to be avoided. One worked to be good, not to be happy. This process may have started with the church, but it had long since become common sense, Weber wrote. The Puritan wanted to work in a calling. We are forced to do so. French scholars Luc Boltanski and Yves Chapello have built on Weber to argue that the spirit of capitalism has changed over time, bringing with it new versions of the work ethic. The spirit of capitalism of each age, they wrote, must answer 3 questions. How will people secure a living for themselves and their families? How do they find enthusiasm for the process of accumulation, even if they are not going to pocket the profits? And how can they justify the system and defend it against accusations of injustice? Justification of capitalism is necessary because people do challenge it. People look at its processes and see the inequality that has resulted. They rebel, they strike, they riot, they refuse to go quietly to work in a pandemic. Those challenges then force crises and changes in the system, which has to adapt to find new justifications, new mechanisms by which we'll consent to keep working. Those struggles spill over from the workplace into the rest of our lives. Political philosopher Nancy Fraser calls them boundary struggles, battles over the lines between economy and society, production and reproduction, work and family. In the shifts created by these struggles, new work ethics and new spirits of capitalism emerge. We know the spirit of the Fordist bargain. It's the one depicted in 1,000 nostalgic stories where workers went to the factory and came home to a family and had weekends off, vacations, and decent benefits. That family could afford to buy nice things on one income. A worker in the factory would have a wife in the home who did the work of looking after the children and shopping for the things the family needed. This was the era of the family wage, the organization man, the suburbs. Unlike the Protestant ethic, the industrial ethic promised at least some goods to workers now, rather than what the industrial workers of the world used to call pie in the sky when you die. Work was a path to social mobility, but whether people enjoyed doing it was still beside the point. Something had to shift to get us from the industrial work ethic to today's labor of love ethic, where we're expected to enjoy work for its own sake. Today's ideal workers are cheery and flexible, networked and net savvy, creative and caring. They love their work but hop from job to job like serial monogamists. Their hours stretch long and the line between the home and the workplace blurs. Security, the watchword of the industrial ethic, where workers spent a lifetime at one job and earned a pension on the way out the door, has been traded for fulfillment. And the things we used to keep for ourselves, indeed the things the industrial workplace wanted to minimize, are suddenly in demand on the job, including our friendships, our feelings, and our love. And I just want to skip ahead to this last bit here because this last little bit I think is relevant to today. The difference between what the movements of the 1970s wanted and what they got was telling. They wanted democratic control over the firm. They got employee stock ownership plans. They wanted less work, a life less dominated by demands of the boss. They got fewer jobs and work fragmented into gigs. They wanted less hierarchical trade unions. They got union busting. They wanted freedom for creative pursuits. They got, in Mark Fisher's terms, managerialism and shopping. They wanted to change their relationship to the patriarchal nuclear family. They got admonitions to see coworkers as family and the need to be constantly networking. They wanted more interesting work. They got simply more work. They wanted authentic human connection. They got demands to love their jobs. So.
Great. Well, thank you. So, my first question, which you were sort of getting at in the end there when you were talking about what the demands of the 60s and 70s were from people who wanted to see changes at the workplace, and then what they got. Related to that is just a general question of why are we being forced to love our jobs at this point? Is it just because like the nature of work has changed so much that we're not working in these jobs where nobody gives a shit if you hate your job, as long as you stamp out the certain number of widgets that you need to get on the line out every day, then that's fine? Is it because those jobs are not essential to in raw numbers our economy in the same way, or is it something else? Is it in response to the kind of movements that you just mentioned? Like, why do we have to wrestle with this damn question? Why did you have to write a book about this in the first place?
I know, right? Yeah, I mean, I think the answer there is all of the above, right? Like the argument that I, following Boltanski and Chappello, take in that section there is that the demands of the 60s and 70s, right, were for a variety of things that I just sort of listed off, but like they were famously, the Lordstown workers, Lordstown syndrome, the sort of discontent with industrial work was rife in the late 60s. And this is going to come up in the thing you're working on, Micah. And so workers are demanding a lot of things in those moments, right? They're demanding less boring work. They're demanding an end to the speed up. They're also demanding changes to their unions, right? You have things like the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement in Detroit, or Detroit Revolutionary Union. It's the Dodge. I always get the acronyms wrong. Sorry. Drum. Read Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. It's a wonderful book. They're arguing for less racist workplace and less racist unions. So you have this sort of challenge that's going on both to the existing sort of structures of the labor force and the old left and all of these things. And also you have the profit squeeze happening. So like literally it becomes too expensive for capital. Well, it's not too expensive for capital, but they don't like the fact that they're not making profits because workers are getting actually a bigger and bigger share of the pie. So the solution to that was ship the jobs overseas, automate as many of them as possible, or just even move them to the parts of the US that don't have unions in them. So, we have more factories in North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, right? And then you also get the incorporation of these demands in really just backwards ways, right? The way that capital is quite good sometimes at absorbing the demands of workers and turning them back around on us. So my favorite example of this is the port trucking industry, which some folks are probably aware of, that was up until 1981, I believe, early 1980s in any case, was a unionized industry. They were Teamsters. It was mostly white men. And you had drivers of color and women saying, we can't get into this union, we can't get these good jobs. So the solution, instead of sort of pushing the union to open up the good jobs to the people who want them, is to deregulate the entire industry. This goes through Congress, bipartisan bill, Ted Kennedy was involved. And what you get is the port truckers are Uber before Uber. So then they all become independent contractors. They have to own their own trucks or lease them from the company. They're basically going through all of the same conditions that Uber drivers are now, long before there was an app involved. And this is sort of the way that this really cynical motivation of deregulating things gets blamed on workers of color. And this, of course, just stokes racism. And then we have the mess that we're in now, right? So, and then the other thing that happens as the jobs are disappearing is those single incomes don't work anymore. So women have to go to work, right? Because you no longer have the factory job that would actually pay the so-called family wage. Women have to go to work. Women, Gabe Wynett's forthcoming book is very good on this. Women end up moving into industries like healthcare, and those become a bigger and bigger part of the economy. The service jobs are the ones where you have to show up and smile all day, right? So like that's the way that creeps in a lot of cases. So yeah, and then we can talk about what, management theorists and stuff were arguing at the same time, but I find it more interesting to tell the story from the point of view of the people who are getting screwed, not the people who are doing the screwing.
Now, your book there's a profile, like each chapter is basically a profile of a different industry where these demands are being put on workers, ranging from teachers to domestic workers to artists to nonprofit workers and academia. Can you just sketch out maybe what the through lines are, what the threads are that run through all of those different industries that you cover? Like what are the sort of basic tenets of this demand that you love your job and you love your work? It just sort of doesn't matter which industry you work in, but that is like central to that demand on you and your emotional inner life.
Yeah, so I separated the book into two sections because the more I sort of thought about this and researched and reported, I found that there are sort of two directions that this goes in, right? One is the sort of creative work that is rooted in these sort of old narratives about artists, that they weren't really workers and this wasn't really work, and artists are just sort of naturally gifted and brilliant and magical, and you will make art even if you are starving and living in a garret and cutting off your ear and dying of consumption or whatever it was, right? And that narrative ends up creeping into fields like journalism, which, you know, once upon a time wasn't actually this sort of romanticized thing. It was every town had a newspaper, and that newspaper probably had a union. Sometimes towns had like 3 or 4 newspapers. I know that's crazy. And then I start the book with the unpaid work that women mostly are expected to do in the home, and the way that that shapes all of this caring labor that is, of course, because Kenzo is going to talk about it here, not done only by women at all. It's in fact done by more and more men. And in fact, one of the things that's shapes the last 40 years or so is that more and more men are doing these jobs that were gendered feminine, and that has a lot of impacts on things.
And so I guess what are the I mean, we're talking about the demands about love that are made on workers today. I mean, it seems to me like you say this in the book that like instead of wages you get love, mm-hmm. right? Like it's a nice like substitute for, you know, actually ponying up some substantive stuff for workers. It's like, because if your job is your life's fulfillment, then like it's fine that your wages are stagnant. It's fine that we're trying to cut your benefits. It's fine that we're trying to gigify you or whatever. And also
schools when you're going to get coronavirus.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I was going to say with teachers, it's like, well, you know, if you write about how it interacts insidiously with things like standardized testing. It's like, well, if your standardized testing scores aren't good enough, well, that's just because you clearly don't like love your job and love your students enough. And yes, that's exactly where I was going to go, which is that if you love your job enough and if you love your students enough, then you'll march into hell, into the buildings of Chicago public schools. Even as numbers are astronomically high, even as we have like literally thousands of people dying every day, like you will do that because of your love for the profession and for your students. I mean, Kenzo, you feel like you're hearing that, whether explicitly or implicitly right now here in Chicago with the fight that you and your union are currently in?
Oh, Kenzo, you're muted.
You're muted, yeah.
You'd think I didn't have a podcast myself. We're definitely feeling that, and it's so jarring because the reason why we are fighting so hard to stay learning, with the distance learning, is because we love our kids. And, you know, I've talked to my students. I teach seniors and juniors, and overwhelmingly, what they're saying is they're pissed that they're going to miss prom and graduation for very good reason. Like a lot of my students had to climb mountains to get to where they are at this moment. And, you know, in CPS, 8th grade graduation is a very big deal. And then senior graduation is an even bigger deal, especially if you're teaching students in more working class and poor communities. So I feel them on that, but they also say, but we also don't want to die. And they know. And there's never been a more just clear tale of two cities tale as like how the pandemic has hit us here. one of the first people that I lost was a former student of mine named Carl, who I was a mentor to him. So he was 31 years old, and he died within the first 3 months or so of the pandemic. So for Black and brown communities and working class communities in Chicago, there is a pandemic. We feel that. And for teachers teaching in those communities, they're sensing that before a lot of, people, their peers probably. And it's why 20% of parents have opted their students into distance learning. And 80% say hell no, even though that, it's been a travesty. So it's been just, we're very clear-eyed about what we want and what we want for our kids. But being beaten over the head over and over again about how we don't love them because of that, it's infuriating and traumatizing.
Can you remind people what the current state of things is with CPS and Mayor Lori Lightfoot now, what's being demanded of you and what the union is responding with?
We are in this is the perfect moment to be talking about this. Because this is one of those moments where I'm getting texts that I don't have an answer for. Sarah knows and Micah know because they both have sent me those texts many a time. Sarah's great because she's always like, should I buy my ticket to Chicago whenever we're about to go on strike or something? But where we are now is we voted overwhelmingly as a House of Delegates. Those are the representatives for the union that all are rank and file members. We voted overwhelmingly to continue teaching distance learning, even though the Board of Education has maintained pre-K through 8th teachers in this phase now will be called back to work. As a high school teacher, well, just to back up, I was shocked because I, at one point, was told I would have to go back, even though my wife is immunocompromised. She has stage 4 breast cancer, and I asked for an exception on it. I don't know if it was actually a paperwork error, but they rescinded it. It could have also been the tweet that I sent that got 12,000 faves saying the Board of Ed has forced me back to work, and this is, my condition. So I just also been maintaining to people that even though that was rescinded for me, I'm still going to be standing with my brothers and sisters. I'm not going to cross a picket line because I have more Twitter followers than other teachers do. Like I just happen to be able to amplify what's happening. And, sadly, there are people even in worse situations than me who are teaching. So, the board wants us, at least, the majority right now of the profession to go back into the schools. So it's going to happen. Well, initially, the board wanted school to start this past Monday. CPS does this a lot. They can't implement things on time, so they pushed it to this Thursday, so tomorrow. And so tomorrow's going to be a big day. We're going to have to, everyone pay attention to the social media, what happens, because we're going to continue teaching distance, all of us, and principals might be directed to lock people out of Google Classroom, which is the only way we are legally allowed to contact our students. And if that happens, then we're all going to probably walk. So yeah, stay tuned. This is, a very pivotal moment.
Yeah, I think people will probably be called upon, like the people who are watching this, right? Like for those who are in Chicago to show up.
It's expected if you're in Chicago.
Yeah. I mean, this is critically important. I mean, I haven't read every article about this, but I did read one in the Chicago Sun-Times about a teacher. It's just a heartbreak. I mean, every story you read about anybody who dies of COVID is obviously heartbreaking, but one of your coworkers somewhere in this city, I remember she said that she was immunocompromised. She left her house 8 times, I think, in the entirety of the pandemic thus far, because she was so terrified. She went to school once, caught COVID at school, and died very quickly afterwards. So this is not a theoretical question. There's already Chicago teachers who have died because of the push to reopen these schools. And there's going to be a lot more if this continues to happen. And also, much like with everything that the CTU does, there are literally millions of teachers around the country who look to the CTU. Actually, millions, however many teachers. There are many teachers around the country.
There are probably millions of teachers.
Sure, probably.
Assume, right?
Yeah. who look to what the CTU is doing, and the CTU. I mean, Sarah says in the book that the teachers' strike wave started in 2012, and in 2012, of course, that's when the Chicago Teachers Union went on strike, and the CTU has really set the pace for teachers unionism around the country. So all eyes will really be on what goes on with you and your union, Kenzo, and we're obviously backing you 100%.
Yeah.
Sarah says in the book, and there is a book on education, or a chapter on education in the book, and you say at one point that teachers are perhaps the ultimate laborers of love.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a question for both of you. Teaching seems different because if you work in another one of these kind of industries that you profile in the book, and you know that your boss is using this idea of loving your job to try to squeeze more profit out of you, to try to squeeze more work out of you, to settle for less money, et cetera, et cetera. And you like, if you think about it, you can be like, okay, that's obviously bullshit. But with teaching, it's difficult because people like Kenzo really do love their students, as you just heard Kenzo say. And in fact, as you talk about in the book, Sarah, there's a history of like teachers unionism done the bad way, where essentially that love for students is rejected, and then you just talk about the classic example is 1968 in Ocean Hill-Browns.
Al Shanker, baby.
Yes, exactly. This sort of teachers unionism that doesn't put that love of students and community at front and center, and it ends in very bad ways. So that's a very tough situation to navigate, because it's never cut and dry when you're being beaten with your love for students, and when your love actually should be put front and center.
The thing that I think is the pandemic has really shown is a couple of things, right? Because I'm working on a story right now actually about teachers finding ways to heroically be creative teachers virtually, which is just friggin' impossible, right? And it's interesting because a lot of the way that you get beaten up for not loving your students is because it's easy enough to argue that teaching isn't really capital accumulation. Nobody's really profiting from you going into schools, except what we've seen, what the pandemic has made very clear, what a teacher's strike also makes very clear, is that capital accumulation doesn't happen if all the kids are at home, because the parents then have to take care of them, and it screws the entire system up. And so what's really striking to me is I'm talking to teachers like Kenzo, all of these teachers that I talked to for the story, who are working themselves just their eyes are crossed, losing their minds, just staring at a screen all day, trying to reach these kids in whatever way they can. And because that is separated from the physical part of I don't want to say the babysitting role of it, but literally being responsible for these children in a room somewhere, the part that takes that away from anybody else having to do it, you see so clearly that to Chicago public schools, that's actually what they care about. They are not putting this kind of effort into giving you support to be a better teacher remotely. They are just get those kids back in the room however we can.
And one of the real just prime examples of how we live in a failed society. And I'll be more uplifting later, but the fact that we can't just sit around a table and be like, okay, this is a big hole in society that we need to fill in, is the fact that, teachers, like Sarah, you're saying, we're being hammered to perform during this. We're being hammered to recreate the classroom online. Many of us doing this for the first, and y'all know I'm an extremely online person. It doesn't translate to the classroom, and we're being forced to do this while our students, many of whom, because of the pandemic, have to work to support their families. Their parents are getting laid off, and it's not like their parents are getting laid off and they get unemployment. It's not that simple for working class folks, especially undocumented folks. If they lose their jobs, the parents who you've been maybe working at a factory for years, all the kids are going to have to get jobs at Target or Costco then, making less money, but contributing so they all can stay together. And Sarah, I love how you brought up how when women were called into work, how that changed the family dynamic. We're seeing this hyper neoliberal process right now, just wreaking havoc on the families. And then as teachers, we're expected to have our data still look good. And what's going through these students' lives. And that's another stress that we have, is trying to patch over for capitalism, where where capitalism fails society. Teachers and other care workers, we're the ones that have to like cement it over and pretend like there's no problem.
Right. Well, in normal times, even when there's not a pandemic going on, because we don't have a welfare state, you are the one. What we do still barely clinging to is a public education system, and the teacher becomes, as Sarah said, the ultimate laborer of love, the person who is has to do everything from being a teacher to being a social worker, to play all of these roles because there's all of these gaps in our social safety net. Another thing I wanted to bring up is that in 2012, the CTU's strike played this really key role in completely shifting the narrative around public education and education reform. I mean, neoliberal education reformers were on the march in 2012 when the CTU went on strike. And it seems clear to me that the CTU strike was the single most important thing in really shifting that narrative and really putting the neoliberal reform types on their back heels. But thank you, Sarah. But now, and it's short. Buy it at Pilsen Community Books. It's on the shelf. I saw it there before they closed. So that's been in sort of decline in recent years, until basically the last couple months, when I feel like there's been this kind of revival of liberal. They're like trotting out the old talking points that were used to blame teachers for the state of students, their poverty and the state of schools and low test scores and all of that stuff. I mean, there's a rising discourse, for example, among some liberal political writers about like the desperate need to reopen the schools right now because it sucks to not be in school.
They don't like having their kid at home.
Maybe, but there's a revival of that discourse. Of course, we're in Chicago, where our mayor is Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who is a real darling of many liberals in this city and maybe around the country for folks who are paying attention. And she's the one who's really pushing for people to return to school. So we have this kind of revival of this liberal anti-teacher and anti-teachers union discourse that's been sort of re-cropped up during the pandemic, it seems.
Yeah, what is Lori Lightfoot's problem? I don't get it. Did she not learn from Rob?
I don't get it either. I mean, that's
like, I tend to assume that people who can win an election to be the mayor of one of the, major cities in the country aren't that like dense, but I just like this sunk Rom's political hopes, right? Like, he's done.
Well, with her, one of the things with her is that about 24 people were running for mayor at one point.
Yeah. And
everyone had some sort of shady connection, in some way. And, the front runner, Toni Preckwinkle, she unfortunately had connections to some of the dirtiest people in the machine. She was our best bet. I stand by that. She was our best bet in that pool. But people were, voting for Trump. Like there was a definite anti-establishment feel in the city, and we didn't have a good anti-establishment candidate coming out of the movement that we could all get behind and rally behind. So a lot of left people or progressive people, Lakefront liberals, kind of went for Toni Preckwinkle. Lori Lightfoot, she had clean hands at that point. However, we knew that she was a prosecutor and a corporate lawyer with Mayor Brown, which is like Kirkland Ellis's, off-brand shop. Like, she's someone who goes hard in the paint against workers a lot. And that was something that was hard to get across, I think, to a lot of the Lakefront liberals and the progressives, was that like, she doesn't need a record. Like, she has a path, she has a pattern, and that pattern is going to follow her into office. So she won with 18% of the vote to get into the runoff, because it was all a fractured vote where like a Daley couldn't even get into the runoff. And then it became her and Preckwinkle, and all that Lightfoot had to say was Ed Burke, who was the most corrupt. In fact, he was an alderman who was reelected shortly after being indicted for allegedly shaking down a Burger King for for what Alderman Shake Burger King's down for. So that was a big mess. So she's never had popular support in the city.
Yeah.
So it's, this is one of those conversations we had late at night during negotiations in 2019 was like, how do we get at someone who, doesn't seem to have much humanity, doesn't have roots in the city, and doesn't seem to have any fear of the political repercussions she's having on herself.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's, I guess, odd duck. Let's leave it at that.
Well, I think it's up to you and your union to create those political repercussions for her.
It has been for a while,
Yeah.
No, and I think this is really interesting, though, right? Because I spent so much time, I said a lot about teachers and the Chicago teachers in particular in my first book. And so I was like, okay, I'm still going to write about teachers. What do I have to say about teachers that I didn't already say? So I sort of just went deeper into the history of teachers unions and like the things that I learned about this sort of history. Like we're joking about Al Shanker, who was the first president of the UFT when it got collective bargaining rights in New York, and then became president of the National AFT and whatever. Anyway, I learned a lot about the beginnings of the Chicago Teachers Union, the women who ran it and kept getting pushed out of the way by the dudes, which is, Margaret Haley, who I really want somebody, maybe it'll have to be me, to write a good biography of because she seems like an amazing figure, right?
Awesome. Yeah.
And that when this union was being founded, these women who nobody thought were like smart enough to do this went and looked up the tax records for the city and found out where the money was being wasted. So they got themselves a raise, they got more school funding. And I was like, oh, this is like CTU now going after the TIF funding, right? And the same thing with like communist teachers in New York were very much doing the same kinds of things, but they were arguing about racial justice. They were arguing about teaching culturally relevant curricula. Like it was just all of these stories. And I was like, oh, every time teachers unions are good at what they're doing, this is what they're doing. And we keep losing this for some stupid reason because we don't know our history. So I found all of this stuff and it was like, oh my God, this is such amazing history because it just is such a clear precursor to what CTU did so well that has now been replicated across the country and is now like being imitated in other countries. Like I can't tell you how many of my friends in the UK who are teachers and who are whatever are like, oh my God, like the CTU, we need to talk to these people. Because they also just they went to the brink of a national strike because Boris Johnson wanted to force them back into school, even though they have the worst death toll in Europe right now. And so, you're not just inspiring America, you're inspiring the world. But I think that's a really, really interesting story to think about, like the history of unions and the history of organizing this way and organizing alongside the community and what people now call bargaining for the common good, that it has a deep history that we just sort of keep losing.
My favorite detail from my research of that same era of Chicago teacher unionism was a protest downtown when teachers who hadn't been paid were hurling textbooks at cops who were on horseback in downtown Chicago.
I want like a painting of that over my desk.
And they also stormed the Board of Trade and banks. Yeah. They were, by the definition of the word radical, they were radicals. They went straight to where the power is. And they did stuff that, I'm afraid to do, to be quite honest.
What, Kenzo, you're not going to go out and throw textbooks at cops tomorrow?
On Monday.
Don't tempt me.
Say that on air. No, so Micah, you mentioned your research, and now I'm gonna be annoying journalist girl, be like, so I want to hear about your research because the work that you're doing now, this oral history book, sounds like you're sort of talking about this period that I'm arguing was so pivotal in the shift between the sort of industrial work ethic and what comes after.
Yes, that's the great tragedy. I mean, all of these people that I'm interviewing for this book who got jobs, they were New Left radicals. Most of them were members of socialist groups of one kind or another. And it's actually, this is an interesting thing to talk about in light of your book, because they are not people who, they were like cadre of socialist organizations who did like crazy heroic stuff, like moving to West Virginia or to Pittsburgh, or just Detroit, uprooting their lives and moving around the country. To work what were, still very brutal industrial jobs in places like steel and auto, also in teaching and some other places, but especially in heavy industry. And this is Sarah, I'm going to turn it around on you. I'm going to ask a question back on you, so I don't talk about myself. Because obviously the people who did stuff like that, I mean, there were a tiny number of people. I mean, they're not indicative of the broader shifts in the economy or anything, except for how they were victimized by how those industries ended up declining. But they were people who they threw everything, their entire lives, into this work out of this, I mean, a version of love. Yeah. I mean, they didn't love the work itself, but they made the work the central thing in their lives and said, I'm going to, for in many cases, 20, 30, 40 years, dedicate myself to working these kinds of jobs with my true passion, my true work, which is to rebuild the labor movement and try to build the socialist movement, et cetera. And so I wonder what on the one hand, we see how like a tech worker being, bludgeoned with love is nefarious. But what do you say to the people who, or people like these people who I'm interviewing, or people who are, in some cases burning themselves out in organizations like DSA or other, jobs that they really, really do care, jobs or organizing that they really, really do care about. And on some level, you need that kind of willingness to throw your whole being into, I mean, that's how the civil rights, that's how every movement in American history has ever succeeded, is because people were willing to make those kind of sacrifices. But on the other hand, we know the dangers of doing that and burnout and everything else. So how do you weigh all of that stuff?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, I wrote a piece for Dissent that's actually kind of a review of Anne Helen Peterson's book on burnout and kind of a combination of other things. And one of the things I talked about was like activist burnout, which she doesn't really touch on in that book, but is a really real thing, like we're talking about. And it's not good for the movement, right? But the thing is, like, now we just sort of have these discourses of like self-care, which, especially in a pandemic when, like, I've been living alone for the last 3 months, I haven't like hugged another person in a while, y'all. Self-care just feels like absolutely inadequate. Like the degree to which self-care is just not working for me right now is really clear. But, when I was in places like Ferguson, when I was reporting for my first book, functional and good and lasting activist cultures that are the kinds of things like what's happened in Ferguson and St. Louis, where they keep winning on the local level. They keep sending people like Cori Bush, to Congress, right? Like, they have a culture of community care, of movement care, of taking care of each other within that space that says, like, if you see somebody who looks like they're wrecked, you say to them, like, yo, Kenzo, I think what can I do? Can I like bring you lunch tomorrow? You and Aaron and you seem like you need, something. What can I do to help? And that, like, that's built into the community so that we're actually building spaces where we take care of each other, so that these moments, like I did 2 book events today. One of them was with my comrades in London and one of them is with y'all. And it's just like, I'm so happy to see all of your faces and to have these conversations. And like, technically this is work. Technically I am on my 13th hour of work today. But this is also movement work for me. And these conversations, especially when we're talking about like the actual political struggle that's going on in Chicago right now, like, we have to build a way for the movement to feed us and take care of us. And this to be a thing that like leaves me feeling good at the end of this conversation and not just burnt out and exhausted, and leaves Kenzo and the other teachers on the picket lines feeling like the community has their back and there are people there, and that I can't buy a plane ticket to Chicago right now because I'll get COVID, but I will be tweeting about it, damn it. And that is really important. And then also in the book, I write about sort of nonprofit work and activist work and the way that this does come into play when that is also your job. And I profile a young woman who was a Planned Parenthood clinic staffer. And this is like she's a combination of many things there, right? She's a nonprofit. This is actually, somebody asked this question, so here I am answering it, as I see it in the chat here. She's also a healthcare worker because she's working in a healthcare clinic, and she's working in this incredibly politicized environment where there are like literally violent protesters outside every day. It's really intense. And in all of that, when the Planned Parenthood workers said they wanted to unionize because they were, doing all of this for like $12 an hour, they were union busted. Mm-hmm. And this has happened in the Planned Parenthood is set up by affiliates. So like different people run the different ones. She was at Planned Parenthood of the Rocky Mountains, but this has also happened in Texas, especially since the pandemic. There was like an uprising at Planned Parenthood of Greater New York. This has been an ongoing problem where, again, they do rely on that dedication that people like Ashley felt for the movement. And that she is, and she doesn't work at Planned Parenthood anymore, but she's very much still a part of this movement. But she was like, I have to draw a line between my commitment to this movement and my commitment to this institution. Mm-hmm. And this is a real big challenge. I think it's a big challenge for a lot of us who are in the labor movement, which is like, how much loyalty do we have to like this union qua union, or how much loyalty do we have to the broader issues of worker struggle and solidarity? And that sometimes means going at the leadership of your union or taking over. Mm-hmm. But that sometimes means being real public about the fact that like this union, this worker center is not treating its staff well, and that they are also workers. And this is also, we can't have a movement that fights for rights for workers and doesn't respect the rights of the people who are doing that work. And Kenzo, again, is somebody who's been both a union staffer and a rank and file member and leader. And yeah, in both of those positions, you're still the same person who's still dedicated to fighting for labor in general, teachers in particular, Chicago teachers in extra particular. But if your working conditions suck when you're working for the union, that's not good for the union. So I think this is a really, it's an important thing to deal with, and it's a difficult one to deal with because like we all know that we do this. We all know that we work too much for these things, and that we burn ourselves out and we exhaust ourselves. And also that like it is on some level the thing that gives us all life too.
Yeah. Being a union staffer, I taught in the classroom, and then I was a union staffer for some time, and now I'm back in the classroom. And, I went back to the classroom for some political reasons. I believe in the rank and file strategy and kind of, folding people into union leadership and staff and then coming back to the rank and file eventually. But also it was the amount of emotional labor that it took having to work with people on the worst day of their life almost every day of my job. Yeah. This is something that a lot of very good union organizers and even field representatives feel, because people, you're organizing, you're doing the good work, you're trying to build, bigger formations out of labor, but on a daily basis, you have someone call and say, I just got fired, or we're going to go on strike, or I just lost my insurance while on strike. And my job is a comms person. It was an organizing job for me as well. I got to know the rank and file workers, and they told their own stories. So almost on a daily basis, I was writing press releases about teachers being denied cancer treatment from districts and things like that. And it was good work, and I was very proud of that work I was doing, but I didn't feel like I could mentally handle that for much longer. And that was a very well-paid job, and we had really good insurance, and it was a very difficult decision to make as someone who supports a family. But I also knew that it's not something that I could have done like in perpetuity. And kind of coming to that realization brought me back to the classroom, and we had a good year and a half or so of me being a good classroom teacher, and then a strike, and then a pandemic, and now maybe another strike. So eventually I'll get to retire, I hope.
So, retirement, what's that?
Yeah, that's something we would really actually love, is the possibility of retirement. So we've been talking about mostly, like teaching and movement work that has this real level of ambiguity in how love can be weaponized against us in doing those jobs, but we also feel love for the jobs and for what we're trying to build with those jobs. But you also profile in the books, Sarah, things that are a little less ambiguous. I mean, like, love is weaponized against people, like tech workers. You have a whole chapter on tech workers in the book. I think it's your tech worker chapter that has some of the worst portmanteaus I've ever heard.
Oh my God, the fampany.
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 God, that's what your book should have been called. Is like fampany.
But I wouldn't be able to talk about my book because it makes me makes my skin crawl.
Right, you couldn't look at the
gross word.
Yeah.
Fampany as well as Plaber, right?
Plaber, yeah. I mean, so doing the tech workers chapter, I knew I had to do a tech workers chapter in this book. And then I was like, video games workers, that's perfect. And also I happened to meet some folks who were organizing with video games workers. And it's an international phenomenon, but in the UK, because of labor law in the UK, they had a slightly easier time forming an actual union. So I ended up profiling, actually, Kevin, bless Kevin. Kevin is from Germany, but he is in the UK. And his story, like, he starts out just being like, yeah, in Germany, I could have gone to university for free, but I ended up going to this, special games programming school that charges you 20-something thousand euros a year, so literally could have gone free university and instead is paying this much money. So he starts out in the hole. And then, you go into these games companies and it's a fampany and it's Plaber and it's fun. Plaber is actually like an academic coinage. That is not one that the games companies have done. Fampany, however, is a thing this damn company brands itself, which is just unforgivable, especially because they fired a union organizer for organizing. So anyway.
There's no room in the fampany for unions.
The fampany. The Wired actually ran an excerpt of the Games Workers chapter. So if y'all have not got the book yet, you can read it on the Wired website right now about all of this stuff. But like the Games Workers, it was really fascinating to me to think about this and to talk to especially a couple of the workers who are a little bit older. Like Kevin is quite young. But this other guy, his name is Carn Bianco, who's also a leader in the Games Workers Union. He was saying that, he was getting serious with his partner. He wanted to like settle down and maybe have some kids, and was basically like, I can't do this with this work schedule that we have because we work so damn much. So he actually quit his job to go freelance because then he could at least like control his hours a little bit more and have like some sort of a reasonable life. Because they call it crunch. It's so endemic in the industry that it's got a cute little name. Although the union likes to say we don't talk about crunch. We call it, extensive unpaid overtime or unpaid overtime because that's actually what it is. It's not cute. And yeah, but the family story, other than the company that literally calls itself a fampany, but it's everywhere. And it's like, it's fun to work here. We believe that you must be fun. And like the company that Kevin works for, which is not nearly as bad as the fampany company, which is just the worst. But the company that Kevin works for, their website is full of like, we believe that in order to make fun games, you have to have fun while making games. And it's like, yeah, but mostly what you're doing is you're sitting there working on code all day. Like, that's not fun, right? And like, the stories of like Facebook and Google and whatever having all of these fun toys to play with in the office and all of that. And like the way I started to think about it, based on a conversation with my friend Julian, who works at the think tank Autonomy in London, was like, these companies are kind of like their wife, right? The company will feed you and it will play with you and it will keep you entertained. It will do all the things that like you might do if you had like an adult relationship. But yeah, I find like that whole thing so interesting and so funny. And also like the Games Workers Union is pretty great and they're pretty militant. And the interesting thing about that too is that they became a branch of the Independent Workers of Great Britain, IWGB, which is mostly a union that organizes low-wage contract workers, Uber drivers famously, and other gig workers, Deliveroo drivers, cyclists mostly, and like outsourced security guards at the universities and other things like that. And so the Games Workers, now they've added some other branches that are more white collar as well. So they've got actually a nonprofit workers branch. It's been interesting to see this collection of workers coming together and the way that they actually find more things in common than you might expect between like the gig worker and the programmer.
I read sociologist Jamie McCollum's book
Yes.
that recently came out. Very good. It's a very good companion book to yours. And he has a line where he interviewed a tech worker in Silicon Valley who was talking about how everybody is always talking about like family and fulfillment in their job, and they're using these like high-minded concepts to talk about what they do. And he was like, these people literally like make banner ads all day. Like, why are they talking about enlightenment and family? Like, they're just like creating like pop-ups or like that's their job. Like,
you're creating the most annoying thing on the internet.
Yes, that's a pretty shitty family. I don't want to be a member of that family. So we have some questions from the chat here. What about UBI, and how do we understand work if it isn't tied to healthcare and financial stability?
Ooh, well, I mean, I was just talking about English workers and workers who are in England who aren't English. And I also talked to workers in Canada. So I definitely did interview workers in this book who healthcare is not, in fact, tied to work. And their work still sucks, but sucks marginally less.
Oh, and I should say, by the way, UBI stands for Universal Basic Income, folks who are unfamiliar.
So, yeah. And so, I mean, financial stability, that would be awesome. I would love some. Could you let me know? I think the interesting thing about basic income now is that we've like broken the seal on it, so to speak, right? Like when Donald Trump mailed out $1,200 checks to everybody and signed his little name to them, and the Republicans own that now, right? Now you can't say we can't just send money to people. Mm-hmm. So now you've got like a Democratic proposal that would up the child tax credit and would actually send it as checks to people. Which, like, you know, we couldn't do because we had to, you know, completely destroy welfare in this country. And I spend a while in the book talking about welfare reform and the welfare rights movement, because this was a demand that came from, again, like working class Black women who were demonized for being on welfare and demonized for being bad mothers, this ongoing thing, right? And like the way that has been broken wide open now, right? Like it turns out that you can, in fact, send everybody money. And now we're just fighting over how much they're going to send us. And, you know, you got control of the Senate in conservative Georgia by promising people $2,000 checks. So, all right. So that's broken. That said, I'm all for a basic income. But the thing is that we're not going to get anything like a basic income or anything else that's actually good for workers without having strong workers' movements. It was Nixon who nearly passed something like a basic income when you had much stronger unions. You had this welfare rights movement that was just absolutely raising hell across the country, which is amazing. The history of the welfare rights movement is just one that, like, once again, I think the left should study so much more than we do. Frances Fox Piven's writing on this. Premilla Nadasen's got a wonderful book. Annalise Orlick has a wonderful book. So much good stuff to learn about raising hell, especially when you don't have a workplace, which is something I think we could think about a lot more when we're thinking about gig work and home care work and all of these sort of atomized work. And like, hell, we're all atomized workers now. So, yeah, I think one of the things that happened this year, briefly at least, was we had a period of time, not very long, a couple of months, where the government sent you checks. And if you got laid off, you got an actual semi-living wage as your unemployment payment. And the world didn't end. And actually what we got was like a really explosive, amazing, massive social movement, which is why they didn't want to, you know, renew any of that. Because, you know, people were setting police cars on fire. So the moral of the story, though, is I think you probably are going to have to set a lot more police cars on fire to actually get more basic income out of the government. But yeah, I think it would be a great idea to separate people's ability to live from needing to work. That's really kind of the goal of socialism, right? Is that you should have a living whether or not you are contributing to capital accumulation. In fact, we want to end capital accumulation. That's the whole plan. Yeah, so that's my sort of take on basic income. And I think I would love to figure out how we understand work if it's not tied to financial stability. I always go back to this line from Silvia Federici about, like, we want to call work what is work, so we might discover what is love.
I love that. It was such a great
It's
line.
such
You
a
have
good
it
line.
in the beginning of one of your chapters, because what's clear in that line is not like we, don't want to love in life. Like we want to we want real love. That's what this is all about. Like we want ways to love each other and love our own lives and love what we do. And like what's so perverse is that it's being weaponized for what you say somewhere in the book is what is fundamentally a coercive relationship of having to work for a wage to pay your bills under capitalism. Like, and so you're being forced to love. I mean, it's almost like an abusive, a classically like abusive. Like you're being forced to love the thing that is like actually extremely coercive of you. And so that quote from Federici really sums it up. I wanted to ask about what you were just talking about, and maybe Kenzo, you can answer this if you want. Do you guys think that Sarah mentioned breaking the seal on direct payments to Americans? Do you think that's what's behind the Democrats, quick backpedaling on the size of these checks that are going to be sent out because they understand that the seal has been broken? So they're like, now we have to manage expectations. $2,000, like that's a lot of money. What if they ask for that again? And what if they ask for it again and again and again? And so like we have to just start scaling it back now to make sure that the expectations are as low as possible, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that's so real, right?
What that reminds me of is whenever I get into arguments with people, or every time you see a budget debate, and people talk about schools, inevitably the conservative person will say, it's a problem we just can't throw money at. And my response is always, when have we ever thrown money at it? How do we know? Let's throw money at it for a while and see what happens. And, obviously students, it goes deeper than that. Students need to have, kind of social democratic reforms in their lives, healthcare, guaranteed, education, after K-12. But, if they just threw a bunch of money at the schools, that would do a lot of good too. And, that's the double crunch that we're in, is that they won't throw the money at the schools. And the funniest thing is, we all make jokes about means testing, but we get $250 a year as teachers in the CPS to work, to buy stuff for our classrooms. And it's a very narrow definition of what's considered for the classroom. And one of the big problems right now during this pandemic is a lot of our electronic subscriptions are being denied. And we have to go through this whole process where we basically have to beg for our money back, where we have to have everything documented. And then even at that, the board it almost seems arbitrarily will deny things here and there. So it's these extra when the cost of education goes up, it gets externalized on us. And that's also tied so much to our love. Like, of course, we're going to buy pencils for our students. And of course, sometimes we're going to buy them lunch because, it's not only our job to teach them, but it is our job to make sure that they're, feeling socialized. And we can't even teach them if they're not feeling safe. So yeah, that's when we talk money. Yes, throw money at the working class. And don't take it away in the back end like Andrew Yang wanted to do with his version of UBI, which is bait and switch.
Y'all, Andrew Yang is running for mayor of New York, and briefly back in New York right now, and it's hilarious. I just want you to know it's real funny. Every day he does something else real dumb. It's great.
Oh yeah,
he's so bad at this.
What Kenzo just said about all of these responsibilities, and what I mentioned earlier, the responsibilities for beyond teaching to like actually provide for your students, and of course you're going to buy them a meal, and of course you're going to buy them pencils. I mean, there's a parallel with that and with what you write about in the book, Sarah, in how reproductive labor in general has so much is assumed to fall on there's a gendered element of it falling on like women in families and increasingly in workplaces still, like you just slough off more of the necessities of life onto the employer's not going to provide for it because there are either formerly women at home who are going to do all that reproductive labor, or feminized professions where all of those things are falling disproportionately on women workers, right?
Yeah, and like that whole structure is so it's so dependent on this idea. And like, I keep, you know, I always go back to Margaret Thatcher because she was the worst. Also proving that like just electing women is not going to solve anything. But, you know, her line about like, there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And like, you know, the reason, well, there are many reasons that I start the book writing about the family, but one of them is like the family is a place where work happens. And the family is a structure that exists the way it does. Again, like back to the Federici line, right? Like we have the relationships in the shape that we do because like capitalism shaped them. I just finally this month got around to reading Greg Grandin's amazing book Fordlandia, which I always just recommend a million books when I'm doing book talks. So like y'all can buy my book and you can buy Micah's books and then you can buy more books.
Buy all of Greg's books, really.
That Pilsen books. I'm happy to get all of them for you. But you know, so in Fordlandia, Henry Ford decides that he's going to open a rubber plantation in Brazil in the Amazon. And it's going to be this like model American style nostalgic town. And even as like their rubber plantation is going absolutely to shit, right? One of the fun things about that is like they couldn't get like native Brazilians to work. They would just like show up to work for like a week and then make a bunch of money and then be like, bye, because they actually didn't need to work that much to live on, you know, whatever in the Amazon. And anyway, but Henry Ford sort of keeps justifying throwing money at this particular problem by saying that it's sort of like a project of like bringing, you know, the American style nuclear family and the home and the whatever to like the people in Brazil. But even, you know, even back at home, Henry Ford had a department that he called a sociological department, which is hilarious to sociologists, that was sort of like the welfare people who would go into the welfare moms' homes and like go through their underwear to make sure they weren't sleeping with men, because if they were sleeping with men, then those men ought to be paying their bills. You know, he would send inspectors into the homes of his workers to make sure they were like having proper, you know, heteronormative sex with their proper wives. And if they didn't have a proper heteronormative family, they didn't get the $5 a day. And so like I already name dropped Gramsci once, but like there's one piece in the prison notebooks called Americanism and Fordism, but I like to think of it as fucking under Fordism because it's just literally about like how capitalism had to sort of standardize sex. And I just imagine like poor little Antonio Gramsci in his prison cell, like, God, I miss sex. But it's a really, really good, yeah.
Sounds like a good pandemic read for a lot of people.
Yeah. But right, it's really interesting to think of the way that like even our sort of romantic relationships, our personal relationships, our love relationships have been deliberately shaped, not just sort of accidentally shaped, but like very consciously shaped by people like Henry Ford, who were just like, this is how you have to be in order to get the family wage.
There's a question from the chat. What differences did you see between large companies and indie companies and how they structure their fampanies? Clearly,
Yeah,
people are latching onto this term now. That
I
we've
can't
been
not.
Yeah, well, AAA companies is specifically a video games company's reference.
I didn't understand what that meant. Sorry,
because
I don't play video games. Sorry.
The one that like specifically calls itself a fampany is a smaller company, but you know, and I didn't talk to anybody who worked at any of the like the real big video game companies. Mostly the people that I talked to were working at some of these smaller ones that do a lot of contracting for AAA games. So Kevin like works on AAA games, but like his company is sort of contracted in because the whole thing is a mess of subcontractors and outsourcing. And like you've got some people in India and some people in Canada and some people in England, and it's just bonkers. Talk about the fissured workplace. But like Facebook and Google are structured like this, right? That like they have the sort of all of the toys and all of the fun and all of the whatever in there. Amazon seems to be slightly less like that and more of just like a barren hellscape where everybody gets fired at the end of the year. But if we have any like, you know, Silicon Valley Amazon workers on the call, I'd love to hear from you. But like, I drew a lot in my book from Kate Lossey's book, The Boy Kings, which is her memoir of her time at Facebook, which I feel like the book came out too soon because it came out like several years ago and sort of didn't get as much attention as it should have because it's a really fascinating story. And she just like talks about like, yeah, they decided to pay for our housing if we moved within 1 mile of the company, except it turned out that she wasn't eligible for that at first because she was a customer service employee. And the programmers were eligible for that benefit until she raised hell, and then she got it. And then she did, in fact, move to within 1 mile of the Facebook headquarters. So, like, even at the sort of top of Silicon Valley, there's still this way that, you are encouraged to see the company as everything to you, to the point where you will move within 1 square mile of the, Facebook campus in order for them to pay your rent. Which, to be fair, like, paying your rent in that part of the country is pretty expensive. But yeah, so I don't know if that's really the answer that the question asker was hoping for. But I just feel like the family narrative is everywhere, right? I hear it from everyone from union staff to games programmers to actual domestic workers who are literally told that you're one of the family until they get fired. And like, yeah, it's so endemic, and it's so funny that everybody wants to draw on the family. And it's like, yeah, well, the family, maybe also we should talk about some of its problems.
There's a question from the chat. Parallels you found between the professional contractor / gigger and low-wage temp workers who experience very similar treatment of disposability, just worse. I think they mean the low-wage workers feel they're both disposable, but the low-wage temp workers have it worse.
As a freelance journalist myself, I know a lot about this particular set of experiences. And yeah, I mean, it is the same, just worse, right? It's that Uber can just sort of shut you out of the app. But then again, I have editors who just like stopped answering my emails. And I occasionally will sort of go through moments of being like, oh my God, have I been blacklisted from the New York Times or whatever? Because yeah, it can be just as impenetrable as the Uber, sort of black box. And yeah, I was talking about the games companies outsourcing and the fissured workplace, which is the reference to like the way that these companies build on having subcontractors and all of these things. This is why the Alphabet Workers Union, the union at Google, announcement was a really big deal, because they were saying we're going to organize top to bottom, including temps, including the service workers, as well as the programmers, as well as friend of all of ours, I think, Alex Hanna, who's a sociologist in the ethical AI department, which is the one that they've just been like rampantly firing people from. So yeah, I think definitely similar treatment, just worse, in that, your wages are normally lower, although there have been times when I was working as a freelance journalist that I would have made more money waiting tables, had made more money waiting tables. So, I think one of the points I wanted to make with this book is that working conditions are a lot more similar than we think they are in a lot of cases. And we can get into sort of hair-splitting fights about class that often miss the very, very similar treatment that happens at sort of multiple levels of the structure.
Kenzo, what about a version of that question for you? I mean, teachers, we all know teachers are not living high on the hog, but teachers aren't low-wage workers, at least in most places, not in Chicago, for example. But of course, there are these through lines from the kind of love that is demanded of you, that you are bludgeoned with on a daily basis, and the work of other kinds of workers. Do you see those kind of through lines there?
Like as far as like, similar struggles to lower wage workers. Well, I think, part of it is our job is working with everyone, and every family in Chicago who works, who depends on public schools. And a lot of teachers I know, myself included, teaching, it was our gateway to the middle class. Like I make more than both of my teachers did combine, or both of my teachers. I make more than both of my parents did combine, like at any time in their lives. So I feel like I do pretty well because of that, but I do also know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. And, my first few years as a teacher, even though I was making probably more than some of my peers, I didn't have, any kind of generational wealth. And so like I was buying all my own furniture and, I had all of these kind of hidden costs. And the same goes with like when you're stocking up your own classrooms. It is a difference when you're, going into teaching in debt. Then, I was DJing weddings. I was DJing weddings as a moonlight kind of gig while I was my first couple of years of teaching, which was a job I thought was pretty cute at first. And then I'm like, I don't want to do this. I want to drink with my friends. I don't want to watch other people drink. I'm stressed out. I'm an inner city teacher. So, I feel like, we are a profession of people who a lot of us did come from, more humble beginnings, I should say. That was a big threat with Teach for America when they were on the rise. That's an organization that gives usually grads from like pretty esteemed colleges a summer crash course on how to be a teacher, and then throw them in a classroom for a year. And then also make them do grad school while they're teaching in some of the hardest to staff schools in the country. So that program, I think, is starting to lose its luster. But that was a big fear, I think, for a lot of teachers here that, if we were kicked out of the profession, we don't really have other options.
Sarah, what is the sort of I don't want to say I shouldn't call it anti-love, but what's the agenda for the pushback against this abuse of this concept?
Anti-work,
love?
man. I'm pro-love and anti.
Well, yeah. Can you explain that for people?
Yeah, it's really fun because like people, y'all are my people, but like some of the folks who have been interviewing me about this book are kind of like, well, what should we do though? Like what kind of advice do you have? And I was like, well, my advice is join a union. My advice is to organize your workplace, right? Because it's not, I might, all of you know that work is political. I assume that most people who are watching this stream tonight know that work is political, but that is actually like a thing that I have to sort of spell out for some people who don't spend day in and day out thinking about work in political context like we do. And so that's been sort of my like starting point with a lot of people is understand that these are political problems that are going to have political solutions that have to be made collectively.
And we can't really say that too many times because so many of our problems are talked about as having individual solutions, including when work is shitty. It's just like, figure out one weird tricks to deal with your shitty job or to meditate or whatever. It's an individualized solution, not a collective one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to say that like, I people sort of expected me to have like the policy prescriptions at the end and like, look, like I can make some policy prescriptions if anybody wants to hire me to like write policy. Well, probably not, but but I can make you a long list of policy proposals, right? Bring back welfare, just give the welfare rights movement all the things that they asked for 50 years ago. Give us a 4-day week, give us a 3-day week, give us a 2-day week. I'm really up for shortening the working week. All of these things are true. But at the end of the day, I'm a journalist. At the end of the day, I go out and I cover movements and I reported on, a whole bunch of different kinds of work in this book and profiled 10 different people who are organizing their workplace, organizing around the work that they do. In the case of, Ray Malone, who is a single mom who's organizing single mothers groups and organizing around basic income, because they're already putting out demands. Right. And those demands are there in each chapter. And I think that that's a great place to start. And organize your workplace. Support CTU, go out and walk a picket line. Like, solidarity is a wonderful form of love where you don't actually have to know people that well, but you actually do show up in, not to get too corny, but I think y'all are with me on this one, that like, it is a deep form of love to show up and, put your butt on the line with somebody else. And I think that is one of the things that keeps us coming back to the labor movement over and over and over again, is this belief that like an injury to one is an injury to all. And like, that's really actually, you know, a thing that motivates me in the morning and at 9:30 at night. So, you know, I think that that's where we start. That is from, you know, from here. I have no idea where we're going to end up because I didn't see this pandemic coming, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it is very clear that unless we do a lot of things differently, the way we're working now is just going to kill us all.
The nice thing about our politics is that whatever the question is, the answer is usually like, organize a union, make your union better. We always have that right handy whenever we need it. You in the conclusion of the book, you have a really beautiful section where you talk, if you'll allow me to get personal for a second, where you talk about sort of your own experiences of late and how you I think is in here, or you've said it on social media, where you sort of like, despite writing this whole book that was about this, you sort of have sought kind of false solace in work in the past, and to you know, distract from the other heartbreaks of life. And you have this great section where you talk about having the time to grieve luxuriously, which I think is something that a lot of people reading that, whatever it is that they're grieving, understand that on a really gut, you know, heart level, that are the way where our life is, our work lives are set up now, is that we aren't able to do that. You're supposed to find love in the job, not like take time from the job to grieve or to do whatever other intense emotion that you have for the people who you actually do love. And you close that section by saying, work will never love us back, but other people will. Which is a beautiful sentiment of what solidarity is supposed to be all about.
Yeah, I'm actually, Micah did not know this, so he's not actually setting me up to do this in this annoying way, but I'm actually trying to write about grief right now because I started work on this. I basically wrote this book proposal in the wake of my father dying, and of course we've just been through absolute hell over the last couple of years. As a society, we're all dealing with intense amounts of grief right now, and capitalist society does not have space for that. Mm-hmm. And I think, building off of sort of where I ended up in the conclusion to this book, very much that, like, I think actually taking the time to say, like, 400 and something thousand people have died of coronavirus in less than a year in this country alone. And that is horrifying. And every one of those people is somebody who we should not have lost the way we did. And to actually like sit with that for long enough to let it sink in. No wonder people came out and set everything on fire this summer. You know, like, absolutely, we should be burning everything down. And I just, so that's a thing that I'm working on, which is, as you might imagine, not easy to write. But I think, that's sort of where I ended up at the end of this, and where I've ended up because of my own life, and where I've ended up because of everything that's been going on around me in the world. And I think taking the time to, you know, and Kenzo, you wrote about this beautifully, actually, about like, you shouldn't have to sort of parade your personal trauma in order to be treated like a human. You shouldn't have to write about your wife's illness in the New York Times in order for people to treat you like a human. The way that we end up having to justify need for like human breaks, just like time to be a human, time to take care of the people that you love while they're still here in this moment when that feels so much more precarious than it ever has. Like this world of work that we are in that like really wants to take that away from you is just like something we should absolutely destroy.
They really want to like means test empathy in a way.
Absolutely.
Like, you know, just as like, you know, when I talk about like, I have to fill out so many forms
Yeah.
All the time, just reminding myself, that my wife has cancer. And I have to beg for things like healthcare for her, or for, discounts on items that other people don't have to buy and things like that.
Yeah.
And it does make me think about this pandemic too, that once people are vaccinated, once things go back, I don't want to say the word normal, but people aren't wearing masks and hiding from each other. Once we get past all that, we're going to have these aftershocks, because people are deeply traumatized.
Yeah.
And people, the way trauma works is you don't really know you don't know it's happening as it's happening.
Yeah.
And it's going to manifest itself in many ways in the coming years. And that empathy, that solidarity, it's going to be so critical, and we have to divorce it from work and from having to means test that empathy. Like, we really just have to be generous with it, and liberal, not politically liberal, but like we have to be very liberal with being empathetic with each other, and that also has to translate into policy. We do need Medicare for all that has comprehensive mental health care included in it. And that's why we keep fighting.
Yeah.
Well, before we wrap up here, Kenzo, we have a lot of people in the chat who are desperate for ways to support the CTU. So can you again sort of direct people to like websites or Twitter accounts or wherever they should be looking to get their marching orders for how to support this union, who, as I said, is really doing the Lord's work right now, which is one of the most important unions in this country right now, the union local. So tell us what to do. Tell us how to help. Tell us how to be in solidarity with you.
Okay, first thing you could do, I know everyone is trying to buy GameStop stocks right now. But if you're going to give $5 to GameStop, please also, I just dropped in the chat a link, give $5 or more to these struggling teachers that have already been locked out. It's a drop in the bucket at this point. We really do need to raise some money, because there were some teachers that were called in a few weeks ago, and they're continuing to teach in distance. One of whom is actually not right now, because she's been locked out, and I know there's a few others in the same situation. So that's going to go to them basically being able to survive. They've been locked out of being able to connect with their students. The Board of Education is saying they're being insubordinate, but they are performing what they need to perform. We got some good news this afternoon, though. The Cicero teachers, which is a suburb just to the west of Chicago, a judge ruled that they're continuing to work distance, even though the district wants them to. The job action of doing that is not considered a work stoppage. So they are going to continue to do that. And the Cicero teachers said they were inspired by CTU to go ahead and do that. One big difference, though, is that they do have an elected school board in Cicero. So if you're in a town where you go grocery shopping with the same people that run your schools, and you can, give them hell when they screw over your teachers, they're going to bend to the will of the community and not to a mayor. As I was saying earlier, a mayor that was not elected in any popular way, but has total authority over the schools. So that's some good news. Hopefully that decision will have some bearing on what happens with us next. But yeah, stay tuned to ctulocal1.org, the Twitter account, and also my Twitter account, which is just at my name, at Kenzo Shibata, because we'll be just posting things as soon as they happen. The thing with strike campaigns or work job actions like this is that things move fast. So sometimes there'll be an action called at the very last minute, in the very early hours of the morning. So it's something you just have to kind of see in real time to be part of. I do believe that we're going to win. And the step after that is to go to other locals and teach them how to do the same, because this is not the next time we're going to have a fight like this in our hands.
Great. Well, everyone, please do as Kenzo says and be ready to be out in the streets or in whatever way the Chicago teachers are asking for solidarity. And then also, please buy this book, Work Won't Love You Back by Sarah Jaffe, out just yesterday. And make sure you buy it from Pilsen Community Books, a wonderful institution that we are extremely lucky to have and we should not take for granted. We should give them all of our money so that they are with us for many, many years and can do great things like this event and all of the wonderful things that they do in Pilsen and in Chicago. So
And remember the last time we ignored bookstores and started shopping online for books, we created Jeff Bezos. Let's not do that again. Let's stop
That's
that.
bad. That's bad. We should not do that.
That's
Although
true. We warned y'all a very long time ago about him.
You did.
We should remind people, though, that if you want to shop for books online, you can buy them from Pilsen Community
Yes.
Books. You can go to the website. I actually don't, what is that? Is it PilsenCommunityBooks.com?
PilsenCommunityBooks.com, yeah. And we have some great Eat the Rich and always carry a book sneaky ACAB packaging, so do recommend.
Great. Well, thank you to Mandy for organizing this event and to Kenzo and Sarah, and congratulations to you, Sarah, on the book. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your book tour talking to other people like this via Zoom and Skype.
Back tour in my bedroom. It's so good to see your lovely faces. And thank you, everyone, for coming. This has been wonderful.
Great.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good night.
Thanks. Good night, guys.